Today, we will talk about reviewing enzyme inhibition. For our purposes, an inhibitor is a molecule that binds to an enzyme and decreases the activity of that enzyme. Inhibitors can bind to enzymes in different fashions. We can either have a covalent interaction. This often leads to irreversible inhibition because we're forming an actual covalent bond between the inhibitor and the enzyme. So a sharing of electrons, if you will, between the two. We can also have non-covalent interactions where all we're doing is interacting through IMFs. This type is reversible. So where do molecules bind on enzymes? Well, they can bind almost anywhere, but if they bind to the active site, in other words, where the enzymatic reaction actually takes place, they are considered competitive inhibitors because they are competing for the same place as the substrate. If they bind elsewhere, in other words, not the active site, they're considered allosteric inhibitors. Normally, an enzyme will bind a substrate to form the ES complex. A reaction will take place. This complex will then become the enzyme product complex, and then the product is released in the next step, regenerating our enzyme or our catalyst for another series of turning over the substrate. One type of inhibition is competitive inhibition, where an inhibitor mimics the substrate but does not undergo a reaction. Our substrate in this case is our circle. We can mimic this shape and electronics using this half moon, and it binds to our active site and doesn't allow the reaction to take place. It's going to be binding to this via IMFs. Another type is uncompetitive inhibition. Uncompetitive inhibition is where the substrate binds to the enzyme, often causing a conformational change in the enzyme somewhere else other than the active site. Our inhibitor can bind to this area that's now opened up, if you will, from our substrate binding, but it only can bind to this ES complex. Once it's bound to the ES complex, our reaction can't take place. It is important to note that an uncompetitive inhibitor does not compete with the substrate for the active site. A third type, or our last type that we'll talk about, is non-competitive or mixed inhibition. In non-competitive or mixed inhibition, this is where an inhibitor binds to an allosteric site, but it can bind whether or not that substrate is bound or not. So this is a little bit different than our uncompetitive example.